Quintus infected. The Procurator morbus. An unearthly contagion. Messinius gave Arios a day to acclimatize, no more. Then he had him armored, collected the first batch of Primaris troopers assigned to him from elsewhere in the Zarquesitor, and requisitioned an in-system ship to take them to Jupiter. He travelled with his new men in the ship's small hold. All of them sat on hard benches along the sides of a space where empty cargo webbing lay in untidy tangles. He had 2 demi-squads, configured as Hellblaster plasma gunners and intercessors. Their leaders were Totvan and Iqua, men from planets at opposite ends of the segmentum. Messinius had already got the impression they were united only by gene recoding and ultramarine blue battleplate, and already he saw his task would be hard. "We will be taking part in this crusade?" Arios asked. His voice was distracted. All of them were distant, Arios especially, like he found it hard to focus on what was happening. Messinius remembered his own ascension to the Space Marines, how much that had changed him, and how difficult his adjustment had been. As Master of Recruits, he had seen it in the scouts new to the chapter, before they were assigned combat duties. Without guidance, the Space Marines were lost, open to the temptations their raw power gave them. Distance was normal in young Space Marines, but what he saw in Arios was something else. We will be departing with Fleet Tertius," said Messinius. "How many of these fleets are there?" Totvan said. "We know nothing, Captain. You must educate us." A couple of the others murmured assent. In Totvan, Messinius glimpsed a questioning soul. He had been awake the longest of the group and was the sharpest of thought. Messinius saw hope there, that the emotional coldness was only a temporary phase and would pass. 10 fleets gather," said Messinius. "Not all at Sol. 6 are nearly ready." "What is our objective?" Arios asked. Messinius leaned back on the bench. The ship was small, built to cover the distance between Luna and Terra in a couple of hours. It was a 5-day journey to Jupiter under maximum power, and the ship's engines complained at the efforts demanded of them. They knew nothing of the Crusade, and little about the current state of the Imperium. He shifted his new power fist across his knees. It was good to be wearing one again, even if he had yet to get the feel of it. "You know the great traitor, Horus?" he asked. They knew this. "The Grand Devil," said a Hellblaster named ck3. "Not a devil, a Primarch, like Lord Guilliman. The Emperor created 18 of them, each the master of a legion of Space Marines. They were made to conquer the galaxy after a time called Old Night, when humanity's first great empire was lost and our species nearly went extinct. But Horus turned upon the Emperor at the height of his triumph, and the Imperium was nearly destroyed. 9 of his brothers fell with him. 9 remained loyal. Our Gene-Father is one of them." "We know this history. Kol put it in us when he remade us," said Iqua. He retained a trace of his harsh birth accent. Like his fellows, he seemed a little dazed, but Messinius suspected a belligerent man would emerge in the days to come. "You will listen anyway," said Messinius. "The war never ended. Abaddon, a warrior of Horus's legion, took up his mantle of War Master, and along with other fallen Legiones Astartes, has waged war on the Imperium ever since. Recently he returned on his 13th Black Crusade, and somehow split the galaxy in 2. They call it the Great Rift." He data-pulsed a cartograph to their helms, showing the ragged line of warp storms. "To the galactic south is Imperium Sanctus. This portion of the Imperium we have re-established contact with. The Crusade's mission is to secure the southern half of the galaxy." "And the north?" asked an intercessor. "We do not know if anything exists beyond the storms. They could extend all the way to the far north. There might be nothing on the other side. Lord Guilliman does not believe that is so, and that we will re-establish contact with the lost segmenta, but it remains to be proven. This part has been dubbed Imperium Nihilus." He looked at them all. "Warriors, you have been woken from long sleep. You have changed. You are confused. The galaxy has changed much since the youngest of you was born, but I must prevail upon you for the sake of our species. You must serve now, and save what we can. Totvan, Iqua, the equipment built into your left vambraces, does it possess a projection facility?" The Primaris Marines looked at one another. "Yes, Captain." "Call me brother, Captain. You must learn to respect one another as if you were brothers. Comradeship is the true strength of a Space Marine chapter, not armor, not bolters." "Yes, brother Captain," said Totvan. Then project the images I will send to you. We will speak of the Greater Crusade soon enough. We have a mission now that we must focus upon. That is the way of the Adeptus Astartes, to complete the task allotted without distraction. Messinius set up a datacast with Totvan. The Primaris sergeant flipped open a flap on the top of his arm, revealing a compact cogitation unit beneath. A projection lens flickered. Totvan made some adjustments and angled his arm so that an image of the Jovian planetary system floated in the middle of the empty hold. "This is Jupiter, home of the greatest shipyards in the Sol system," said Messinius. He pointed out the lattices of orbital yards around the equator and the planet's larger moons. "A third of Fleet Quintus is assembling there. Currently, 2 battle groups are suffering pestilence of unknown origin. We will visit the flagship of the 4th battle group, the battleship Presidium. My mission is to assess their preparations and judge whether they will be ready. You will observe and perform close guard duties." "You have a large responsibility," said Arios. "The Lord Gilliman will have others performing similar investigations. It will not be my say alone that releases or stops a fleet," he said. "But what we find will sway him, and unlike others, we will be arriving unannounced. Our role is important. Understand that." "What manner of pestilence is this?" asked Arios. Messinius rested his head against the shaking ship hull. "One that makes it unwise for me to go alone." The Jovian approach was as crowded as the skies around Terra and took several hours to negotiate. Eventually, they approached the Presidium. Messinius announced his arrival at the last possible moment and was grateful to hear a hint of panic in the answering officer's voice. An attempt at delay was essayed, quickly swatted down by the presentation of the Primarch's authority. After Messinius explained exactly who he was, their ship was cleared with all speed. Messinius ordered the pilot to dock quickly, just in case. Dull clang sounded through the hull as one of the Presidium's docking piers grasped their ship. The Vox clicked. Totvan spoke to him privately. "They'll wake up soon, brother captain," he said. "You do not know what it's like to sleep so long. I was the same when I was revived." "Maybe the Primarch knows," said Messinius. "Maybe he does," said Totvan. The ship shook a little as the Presidium's docking pier finally caught a solid lock. Lumen spun around the airlock door. "Open the way, shipmaster," Messinius voxed. A sharp blurt from a klaxon replied. The inner lock doors opened. They could have opened both sets, but Messinius wanted to keep the biological sanctity of the ship intact, so they went into the lock and waited for the inner doors to shut again before Messinius depressed the release for the outer gate. It rolled back into the hull. On the other side, a pier extended, roofed with nothing but atmospheric energy shielding emanating from the spreading arms of caryatids. An official of the Logisticarum waited for them, flanked by 2 men carrying long-snouted bioscanners. All of them wore heavy-duty environmental gear. The small size of the welcoming party made Messinius suspicious. "Captain Messinius, we were not expecting your visit," the Logister said. "I'm a Logister of the 3rd Standing, Procurator Morbus for Battlegroup Carastus, Sextus, and Septimus of Fleet Quintus. I assume you have come to check on our progress in managing the contagion." "You assume correctly. What is your name?" Messinius asked. "My name is Ceratophes, Captain," she said. Her eyes shifted sideways to look past Messinius at the Primaris Marines. These were probably the first of the breed she had seen. Speculation about them was rife. Tafis was professional enough that this small eye movement was her only concession to curiosity. The open nature of the pier allowed them to see the side of the Presidium clearly. Statues plated with gleaming metal stood in artful groups between the closed hatches of macro-cannon ports. The outer buttressing was finely proportioned. Imperial vessels were often indelicate, but not this one. "A beautiful ship, Procurator Morbus Tafis," said Messinius. He moved to step forward on the pier. Tafis held up her hand, and he halted at the edge of the airlock, towering over her. A young face looked out from the transparent cylindrical helmet she wore that exhibited no sign of Astartes' dread. "If I may beg your forgiveness, please do not step aboard the ship until we have had the chance to scan you for contaminants. We have had to become wary. I apologize if that makes us seem unwelcoming. May we?" "Proceed," said Messinius. "By all means." The 2 men moved forward, more nervously than the Logister, the funnels of their scanners snuffling all over the Space Marines. For good measure, they then passed around the inner airlock. They consulted panels set into the top of the processing boxes, depressed buttons protected with coats of plastic, and waited for a verdict. Lumens shone green. "They are clean," one said. The Logister stood aside. "Then welcome to the Presidium, Captain Messinius. Command ship of Battle Group Carastus, Indomitus Crusade Fleet Quintus." Messinius stepped onto the pier. "You must come this way," said the Logister. "Please, it would be better if we were quick." As they approached the void lock at the far end of the docking pier, it opened, and a second party came out. There were 20 armsmen in void-hardened armour, led by a man wearing the bright bronze helm and wings of a sergeant-at-arms, and accompanied by a midshipman. "Procurator Morbus Tafis," the officer said. "You were quick here?" "It is necessary to preserve the biological purity of this vessel, Midshipman Save." "Even from them," he said. His soldiers lined up either side of the pier. Messinius idly calculated the threat. His sense that something was amiss here grew. Not so idly, he assigned targets to each of his own warriors. Messinius stepped forward. "Especially from us," he said. "We should be treated no differently to others. This is humanity's crusade. Exception breeds resentment and exposes us all to risk." "I am sorry, my lord," said Save. He clicked his heels together and bowed shallowly. "The bluntness of the Adeptus Astartes, as always, cuts through poorly formed opinion. I beg your forgiveness, and ask that you come with us." Messinius looked down at Tafis. She stared straight ahead. "No," he said. "Procurator Morbus Tafis will be my point of contact. I believe she has the expertise to explain what is happening here in the clearest manner." "I understand," said Save. "But Shipmaster Versht was insistent that you come with me to the command deck, where you might discuss these matters directly with the battle group commodore." "I prefer to discuss this with her," said Messinius. He began to stride forward. His immense bulk intimidated the men, and they parted to let him through. "My brothers, escort Mistress Tefis and her men with all due honour." Forming a mobile barrier between the Logister and the armsmen, the Space Marines went to the airlock. It remained closed. "My Lord Captain." "Open this door now," said Messinius. "If you have any problem with my remit or my actions, then I recommend you take it up with the Avenging Sun himself." The airlock opened. "Closed squad vox. Activate Omicron-level cipher," he said to his men. "I do not think we want these people listening to what we say." The ship was in the throes of preparation. Work of all kinds was being undertaken on every level of the interior. Scaffolding covered expanses of the walls, and the lesser transit conduits were full of supply carts travelling nose to tail. In the main spinal way, the crew train rushed back and forth past them 3 times as they headed from the docking spars up towards the lifter nexuses of the superstructure. The crew were all occupied. Shouts and the sounds of machine tools echoed down every corridor and in every hall. No one paid the Space Marines much attention, though when it was realized they were Primaris, they attracted a few curious glances, and everyone was quick to get out of their way. Messinius said nothing while they followed the Logister through the crowds, preferring to observe and guarding his actions and gestures. The frenetic pace of the preparations did nothing to assure him Quintus was ready. There were officers in the crowds watching them, a few inexpertly tailing them. They reached a restricted lifter, keyed open by Tafis's data wand. They entered, and the doors closed, cutting out the noise of the grand junction. The lifter sighed and accelerated into the battleship's towering spires. "The Primarch is concerned that this issue is still unresolved," Messinius said. "We are devoting all our efforts to stamping out the contagion," said Tafis. "Yet it is still present." She nodded tightly. "We will discuss this in a moment, please. Here is too indiscreet." She had removed her helmet, and Messinius could see how tired she was. Large black semicircles shadowed her eyes, and her skin was waxy. The rest of her void suit remained on, though it was bulky and awkward to move in under normal conditions. The lifter decelerated crisply, delivering them to a suite of rooms halfway up the tertiary command spire. Men and women of the Naval Medicae Corps moved with exaggerated care between the various chambers, all of which were closed by airlocks with sanctity wards and machine spirits that asked many clearance questions. She led them towards a room. "Wait here," she told her 2 attendants. The outer lock door opened, and the Space Marines had to duck to pass through. The airlocks were new additions and sized exclusively for baseline humans. Bioscanners hummed and clicked in the walls for a minute before they chimed the all clear, and the inner door opened to an empty laboratorium. "Provide lighting," she said. Lumens blinked slowly on, as if sullen at being awakened. She went to a console that looked out of place and depressed a button. Feedback in his helm and a blinking rune warned him a vox bluff was active. Plastic-shrouded equipment lay quiescent in the room. Tafis went to the center of the laboratorium and turned round to face the Space Marines. Messinius inwardly cursed. If this were a combat situation, he would have blithely walked into an ambush. He half suspected he had. "I'll be brief, because I must," said Tafis. "I am glad you are here. We are making no headway in containing the disease. Battle groups Sextus and Septimus have been isolated for weeks, from us, from Jupiter, from each other, yet still it spreads between the ships in those groups." Messinius made a noise in his throat that came out of his voxmeter as a growl. "Any infections so far of the shipyards?" "As of the moment, it is only Fleet Quintus that is plagued," she said. She rested against a workbench. A tired, involuntary sigh escaped her. "I sometimes feel we are being specifically targeted. This disease is not natural," she said. "What makes you say so?" "I was with the Chirurgeon General of the Astra Militarum before I was recruited to the Officio Logisticarum," she said. "Departamento Contagio. I have seen diseases of all kinds. Sickness with a strong mutagenic effect like this is rare. It has a psychic element. It is touched by the warp." "Your relief at my arrival. This room. Your candor," said Messinius. "You wish me to report this back to the Primarch. You are being prevented from doing so." "As soon as I learned you were inbound, I made sure to be the one to meet you. We cannot control this outbreak, Captain. It is beyond us. There is only one—" She paused and looked afraid. "There is only one organization with the capability to deal with a contagion like this," she said, as calmly as she could, but too quickly to appear entirely matter-of-fact. "It would be best if they were informed." The buzz of the bluff in his vox bead annoyed him, so Messinius unlocked his helm and drew it off. The air in the laboratorium was dry, characteristic of having been filtered too many times. "You have tried to contact higher authorities?" "I have," Tafis said. "My recommendations have been ignored. My attempts to discuss my findings with my own superiors within the Logisticarum regarding this matter have been intercepted and suppressed. I have been isolated." "Why?" She shifted against the edge of the bench. "You saw the reception you were intended. I am sure you can guess." She looked at the ceiling, at the door locks, at the lumens. "I am being watched," her eyes said. The bluff screen was evidently insufficient. "Humor me," said Messinius. "I will hear your hypothesis, and my brothers here will benefit from hearing your reasoning." He raised his voice a little, so any who were listening would hear. "You have nothing to fear. I will make sure of that." She thought a moment. "They do not want you to know. There is a great deal of reputation at stake on which fleet leaves Terra first," she said. "Is Lord Fleetmaster Prasorius aware of this?" he asked carefully. "Aware? Yes. He knows full well how important this is to his sub-commanders, as it is to him. If you are asking, is he involved in this instance, suppressing the nature of what we are facing here, I do not believe so," said Tafis. "Lord Prasorius is a diligent and honourable man. It is my belief that the severity of this outbreak is being kept from his knowledge. The Indomitus Crusade is the largest military undertaking since the Great Crusade, so they say. Even if that is not true, the size of Fleet Primus alone matches the grand army of Lord Solar Macarius, the largest venture launched by the Imperium for 3 millennia. Every family of any rank is involved in this crusade. Every world of any note has a stake. Fortunes will be made, reputations earned that will last for thousands of years. The future lords of the Imperium will be drawn from those organizations and worlds that win the most glory. Imagine the pride of being part of the first fleet to leave Terra. Imagine the shame to have been part of a failure." Messinius's collar stirred. The future of mankind was at risk by short-sightedness and an eye on personal gain. It ever was thus. There would be new trade routes, gifts of land, accolades, offices, all the things that men craved, all the things that blinded them to danger. "What I imagine is this," she said diplomatically. There are men and women responsible for Fleet Quintus who wish to serve the Emperor more than anything. They do not understand the danger this outbreak poses. Otherwise, they would have reported its severity to outside authorities and would have requested that the departure date be amended. Instead, they believe they can get it under control. They are wrong. I see, said Messinius. Have you been threatened? Not yet. You will come with me, said Messinius. We will deliver this message to the Primarch together, personally. But I should get some first-hand experience of this disease. What little we know is confused. I heard intimations of violence. She nodded. That covers it, but barely. I need to see for myself. No one will gainsay my word. That would be for the best, I think. I will speak with Shipmaster Wurst, he said, while we are on our way. And I will prepare decontamination facilities for you, she said. She unhooked her helmet from her belt. You will need them. Chapter 23. Death Phage. The Idios. Combat Trials. They left the Presidium quickly, taking the most direct route for speed, knowing wherever they went they would be monitored. Messinius initiated conversation with Wurst and boldly stated what he intended to do. There was a small chance that an attempt would be made to silence Messinius, but he decided it was a low enough risk. He judged he would achieve results more quickly by brazenness, and he was proved right. An hour later, they crossed several thousand miles to the cruiser Idaeus and set down. The ship was running on low power, only its running lights and beacons on. The hangar bays were dark. Where they were open, the atmospheric fields were out. Shields were down, main motive off. Its sisters were the same, all dark and silent as tombs, only their lights and holding formation revealing that they were not ghost ships and that some order still ruled aboard. They docked at a port right next to the main flight deck and proceeded directly in. Tafis came with them onto the landing deck. It was dark. Air frost gleamed on every surface. There were piles of supplies all around, but they, like the ship's complement of shuttlecraft, had been covered over with tarpaulins, made secure, and left where they were. Things could not have been more different to the scenes aboard the Presidium. There were few people about, and those that were went covered head to toe in either hostile environment suits or void gear. The welcome they received was also different. 3 exhausted officers greeted them, a sub-lieutenant and 2 ensigns. All evinced the same relief Tafis had. "Relief is coming, then?" one ensign asked. He spoke hopelessly, as if he had given up. "It will," said Messinius. "Where are your crew? Have so many died?" "All crew are confined to their quarters. We keep all non-vital sections free of atmosphere, depressurized. It slows the spread. At least in that respect the sickness acts like a normal disease," Tafis said. "Idaeus has not been too badly affected by it, but there have been 6 instances as of today," the lieutenant offered. 913 fatalities in total, 8% of our crew complement. "That is unfortunate, but hardly disastrous for a vessel this size," said Messinius. "The sickness itself is not the main problem," said Tafis. "But what comes after, in a few rare cases, is impossible to—" A short alarm clarion interrupted. An announcement rang out over the ship's voxmeter system. "All hands. Minor manifestation on deck 106, area Epsilon. Contagion contained. Minor presence expected. Armsmen have moved to engage. Remain clear of this section until advised otherwise." "You wish to see the problem," said Tafis. "This is your chance." "What kind of presence?" Totvan asked. "The disease," said Tafis. "It leads to certain manifestations." "There will be combat, then," said Totvan. The sub-lieutenant nodded. "It'll be a stray. Sometimes the infected get away before we can treat them, and bed down in some out-of-the-way place until they—" He swallowed. "Until they ripen. Then we get a situation like this. Any assistance you can give us would be welcome." His statement was met by an orchestra of clicks and whines as the Space Marines activated their weaponry. "We are already on our way," Messinius said. "You have access to our internal auguries," the sub-lieutenant shouted after them. Messinius and his men were already out of the door, heading into the pressurized areas of the ship. Information from the Idios appeared in his helm plate as he ran to kill whatever it was before it could do any real damage. A cartolith led them onward, a pulsing dot their target. Going into action raised his spirits. On Terra, he'd spent long months fretting over details and watching for attacks that never came. Combat was where he belonged. His muscles moved smoothly. His armor systems purred, hours of maintenance and adjustment bringing them to a level of function they had not enjoyed for some years. His new plasma pistol was snug in its holster strapped to his thigh. His power fist encased his right arm. Its weight was counteracted by a pair of coin-sized suspensors screwed into the top and bottom, but contragrav could do nothing about its bulk, and he had yet to adjust his running gait to accommodate it to his satisfaction. It was a fault only he noticed. Those he passed would have seen nothing amiss in his running. Aided by his power armor's supplementary musculature, he ran as fast as an equine. Were he to enter combat at that speed, he would have had as much impact as a charging cavalryman. In case the noise of his warriors thundering along the deck were not enough to clear the way before him, he roared with his voxmeter set to maximum output.
Where? Where? Make way for the Emperor's judgment!
Arios ran at his side, their 10 Primaris Space Marines behind them in double files. They loped where Messinius sprinted. He suspected they could outpace him. They were stronger, and their armor was more powerful. They were running at his pace out of respect. He wondered how they would fare in the coming fight. Ratings and menials scattered from their path. They were all short, even by mortal standards. Life on board an Imperial warship was not easy. They had enough to eat in order to live, but not enough for their bodies to realize their full potential. Deep down in the lower decks, it was as cramped and dingy as any underhive. It was no wonder disease took hold in places like that. If the Space Marines ran one of the crew down, they would be smashed to a pulp, and the Space Marines would barely stumble. Messinius had no wish to harm them, and bellowed his warning over and over again. If any had got in his way, then he would not have stopped. His duty came first. The ship's walls passed by in a blur. Dim lumens smeared into streaks of light. Pale faces watched them from the shelter between stanchions and recessed doorways. Every bulkhead door that opened saw the mortal crew scurry out of the way like rats disturbed in a larder, and on the Space Marines ran. These creatures were too lowly to be afforded full protection and were equipped with respirators only. A data inload from the ship's operations office pinged into his helm. He opened it and found himself presented with a delicate light-weave cartograph of the area of the incursion. The area was a shaft of some kind. He brought up associated detail and read that it was a ventilation exchange junction used to transfer fresh atmospheric mix to compartments after void venting, but the transfer gates were closed and there were only 4 ways in and out. The size of the exchange and the companionways staged at 3 points up its height gave good lines of fire. Those were factors in his group's favor. Red dots swirled round, marking the enemy. Green pulsers showed up the position of the fleet armsmen who had discovered the foe. A standard patrol of 10 reduced now to 6. As he watched, another green marker went out, swarmed by blinking red dots that broke over and through the armsmen and raced off down one of the corridors towards the midline of the ship. They were intercepted by a second patrol coming in from spinewards, but the men would not hold for long. That was the bad news. Messinius grumbled with displeasure. He pulsed the data out to his squads.
Pick up the pace,
he said, pushing himself to run faster, knowing that the Primaris Marines could handle it with ease. A few seconds later, they heard the metallic, brash noise of naval shotguns firing in an enclosed space, the shouts of men, and a horrendous, scratchy buzzing that made Messinius's teeth ache at the root.
Spread and engage,
he said, marking destinations up for each squad on the cartograph.
Hellblasters, watch for fire towards the outer wall. There are several yards of armor between us and the void, but take no chances. No accidental breaches.
They sped down the approach corridor towards the shaft, where battle between man and monster raged, as it had since the beginning of their species, when nightmares assailed shamans in the land of dreams, and contracts with otherworldly creatures led to earthly bloodshed. He knew now what they were dealing with here. Demon plague. Messinius entered the fray first. He clenched his fist within its oversized gauntlet and activated its power field. With his left hand, he shoved an armsman aside as gently as he could, vaulting over him as he fell sideways out of the way. Their arrival came as a shock to the man, and he scrambled backwards and pulled his knees to his chest with his hands, making himself as small as he could. Arios's foot stamped down on his shotgun, breaking it like a piece of kindling. By then, Messinius had already engaged, swinging the giant club of his power fist into the oozing mouth of a warp demon and obliterating it completely. There was the shriveled corpse of a man stuck to the wall, not quite hidden. The cocoon woven about him had burst open from the inside, letting out swarms of Neverborn. The enemy were everywhere, in far greater numbers than Messinius's equipment had suggested. They were lesser things, not the servants of the great demon kings who ruled the Empyrean, but the corruption of some poor soul's flesh. They were small, roughly spherical, covered in tentacles of differing length that gave them an asymmetrical silhouette. Fully half of their form was occupied by a large, snapping maw whose only purpose was to kill. The teeth framed an enormous single eye, seemingly bigger than the body, as if it peered into the human world from the warp. 2 pairs of ragged wings blurred behind them. Messinius and Arios smote them as they cleared the last few feet of the corridor. The creatures were quick, and several dodged the attention of Messinius's fist and Arios's sword, but these were trapped and bludgeoned by the warriors coming behind. As yet, not a bolt round nor a plasma beam had been fired. They arrived at the middle of the 3 companionways that circled the hollow space at the heart of the cylinder. They were wide, made of heavy-duty open grillwork to facilitate the easy movement of air up and down the shaft. Messinius's warriors spread out, bolt rifles raised to their shoulders, firing as they ran. Messinius monitored them closely, this being the first time he had seen them in action, and found himself pleased by their efficiency. The overlapping fire they put out was perfectly executed. They were less stiff than he feared they might be in battle. His intercessors bunched closer together to allow Totvan's Hellblasters to open fire. The demons flew around the walls at dizzying speed. Plasma streams lit up the enclosed space, chasing the things around the metal and leaving scores dripping with molten orange behind. Where the energies connected with their intended targets, the things exploded.
"They are mindless," Messinius voxed. "Corral and expunge them."
He checked the cartograph. The number of red dots in the shaft was dwindling. Many banished, but a small swarm was fleeing down the corridor into the ship, where the second squad of armsmen was already hard-pressed. He looked up to the top level where the corridor's mouth was situated, and saw the things flooding into the opening like sewage down a drain. He estimated their numbers and came to a decision.
"Arios, you have command," said Messinius. "Kill everything that should not be here."
Before the lieutenant could question his orders, Messinius was on his way to the armsman's aid. Tactical prudence would suggest he take a squad with him.
"Prudence be damned," he said to himself.
He needed to fight. As it was, these paltry foes would barely make him sweat. He raced up stairs that joined the second floor to the 3rd level. Bolt explosions and plasma beams flashed all around him. He left the beast rushing into the opening to his men, diving into their swarm and setting about himself with his fist so he could push through to the armsman's position. He drew his plasma pistol and shot behind him, burning the jawed eyes out of existence. The armsmen were ahead, behind a wall of the minor demons. He was now in the thick of the beasts, and they tried to hurt him. Moist eyeballs rubbed against his plate as their teeth locked about his arms and legs. Wings fluttered against him. His armor detected corrosive substances in their excretions and sounded a warning note, but he ignored it, using himself as bait to draw the creatures away from the weaker mortals so he could stamp and bludgeon them to death. He emerged from the creature's press, streaked in gore and singing the battle song of the white consuls. The armsmen on the other side recoiled at first upon seeing him, then cheered as he slaughtered their foe. Between their relentless fire and his rampage, the demons were soon destroyed.
"Arios,"
he was calmer. Some of his frustration had been spent in the fight.
"All warp Xenos are dead, brother captain."
Messinius checked his instruments. From every quarter, his helm reported threat levels of 0.
"You,"
he said, pointing one enormous digit of his power fist at the armsman.
"Join your comrades in the shaft back there and await debriefing."
The armsmen bowed and gave their thanks. They were jubilant now, having survived the attack. The ordeals of faith they must undergo after exposure to the demons, though for no sins of their own, would dampen their mood, he thought. They tramped away. The last of the creatures were dissolving into puddles of black ooze. Messinius resisted the temptation to nudge the remains as they discorporated. Demon gore was bad enough, but the sludge they left as they melted to nothing was a devil to shift, sticking to ceramite so well he suspected it did so purposefully as a last spiteful act on the demon's part. He watched as tentacles shriveled up and sloughed off, exposing the bulbous mass of the single eye, which collapsed into itself like a sculpture pressed from wax melting on a stove. Noxious vapours streamed upwards, heating the air by some sorcerous interaction with mundane reality. The puddle shrank until it was a greenish smear of matter stuck to the deck, and set hard as plascrete. He wondered how many other people in the fleet had ended this way, their bodies usurped by Neverborn. He scanned his immediate surroundings again, calling in data from the ship's internal augers to augment his battleplate's limited sensory suite. Messenius gave the corridor one last look over. The stink of corruption hung on the air. He overrode the ship's machine spirits and shut the nearest pressure door, marked the location of the battle, and passed it on to the ship's command structure. Let them decide what to do, whether they would send in ratings to clean up the mess and the priest to bless the sullied metal, seal the compartment permanently, or vent it to the void, in the hope the vastness of space would absorb the taint of this intrusion. All would be viable. That was not his concern. He flexed his fist. Demonic ichor slicked it an ugly green, where it had not been baked black by the power field. The decoration of his plasma gun was smeared with it.
"Squads, regroup," he voxed. "Gather the armsmen and prevent their leaving. Do nothing to compromise the integrity of your armor. Helmets to remain on. Void sealing protocols stay in force."
He returned to the shaft. Chapter 24. They fought well. Decontamination. The action of warriors. Arios and his warriors were standing to attention around the surviving armsmen. Messenius looked the mortals over. There were the usual signs of terror among their ranks. The demons had been poor specimens, but they all struck an uncanny dread into mortal hearts. Their weakness had no bearing on that. Others of them seemed to have an inkling of what was coming next, and sat quietly. One of them repeatedly called out fragments of scripture to the Space Marines, asking them to join him in prayer. They ignored him.
"You fought well," Messenius said to Arios.
"We are as yet still untested," said Arios. "This battle was not sufficiently challenging." His effect was still off. He was distant, as robotic in the way that he spoke and interacted as he was when he fought.
"That is for me to judge, Brother Arios. I expect a full report on the capabilities of all the men present here today to help me do so."
"As you command, Brother Captain." He voxed Tafis.
"You were correct. Our equipment requires decontamination. These were unearthly foes. Their effects on war gear can be unpredictable, even after death. You have somewhere aboard?"
"Yes. You will be taken there shortly. Do you have enough evidence?"
"More than enough. Return to our ship and wait for me there. You are coming back to Terra with us. If anyone tries to detain you, threaten them with the Primarch's name."
"They are that dangerous, the creatures of the warp," said Arios. "These did not seem so deadly."
"They are more deadly than you can comprehend," said Messenius.
"Is that why we watch these men here? They fought well. I feel—" There was a click as Arios switched from open vocal communication to a private vox channel. He was learning then. "We are punishing them for doing their duty." Arios's concern for the mortal humans reminded Messenius that he came from a very different age. Messenius, as a white consul, held the lives of all humans to be valuable. They were nevertheless part of an equation and must be balanced against other concerns. There was no space for the luxury of kindness for kindness' sake. That belonged to older eras.
"The deaths of a few men are nothing in comparison to the potential loss of this ship. Manifest Neverborn are dangerous, but ultimately simple to deal with. Though they are strong, skilled at arms, and supernaturally fast, a bolt or a blade will kill them as easily as they will a mortal foe. It is those that hide that must be guarded against. They invade people's souls and turn them against their fellows. The creatures of the warp delight in perverting the minds of living beings. It is sport to them. If they find an individual with the latent curse of psychic power, then they will use that person to rip open a hole in space and allow hordes of their brethren into the materium. I have seen this happen with my own eyes. These pathetic things that we fought today were nothing. Those that serve the so-called dark gods are deadly foes, one and all. The problem here is the contagion. It provides a vector for manifestation. That is disastrous.
so close to terror. He shook his head. Will the mortals be killed? Arios asked. His normally emotionless voice lifted a little. Probably not. They are voidsmen. Even if they have no true knowledge of what we faced, they will have heard rumors. Sometimes a little forewarning can help armor a soul. If they are deemed clean of disease, then I am sure they will be spared. Arios nodded. Why is it that my hypnomatic inloads contain no data on these things? They are a new foe to me in every way. Diseases that spawn monsters, demons, these were the stuff of folklore in my time. For millennia, the existence of demonkind was suppressed, said Messinius. Even we, the angels of death, were supposed to be ignorant of the beasts of the warp, though in practice I have never yet met a space marine of any real age who has not encountered them. But there were days when entire chapters were mem-cleansed of their campaigns against the warp spawn, or subjected to total mind wipe. A wasteful way to suppress the information, and in these times, pointless. Who did those things? The Inquisition, said Messinius. The Emperor's own agents? Yes. They would act against loyal space marines in the same way that we are complicit in the possible condemnation of these valiant men. They would, and they do, said Messinius. There are things far more terrible in this era than injustice. I was taught that the Emperor protects. He is not a god, said Messinius. Remember that. He cannot be everywhere. I have so much to learn, said Arios. I will teach you. Messinius paused thoughtfully. It is interesting that Call adhered to the Inquisition's guidelines on the Great Ban. I believe it impossible that he does not know the truth of the warp himself, and he shows scant regard for other prohibitions. It may be our age, said Arios. He began his program long ago. Perhaps it was safer for him then. Messinius glanced at the younger space marine, who was in many important ways so much older than he. That is good thinking. It is probably incorrect, said Arios, though he did so from rational deduction rather than modesty, thought Messinius. Yes, said Messinius. Be thankful you know so little. It is said that the knowledge of these things is corrupting on its own. Maybe Call did not wish to draw attention to your creation. You slept a long time. I have also heard it said that there are spies that lurk in dreams. If there are monsters hidden in bacteria, I can well believe that. There was more he could say, of the horrors he had faced and the secrets he had learned regarding the Empyrean. He refrained. Even thinking about them felt wrong, as though it attracted unwanted attention from outside the ship. Arios, said Messinius. My captain. Next time you fight, allow yourself a little freedom. Your technique is perfect, but you must learn fluidity. Technique can be decoded. Passion cannot. Instinct will give you the edge. Yes, brother captain. Messinius went to speak to the rest of his men. To each he imparted similar advice. Their conversations were interrupted by the arrival of more armsmen and senior priests from the ship's chaplaincy. Company, move out, Messinius said. As his men filed through the door, he beckoned the party's high priest to him. Treat these men as well as you can, he said. They fought well, and they did their duty without fear. In two groups, the Space Marines were directed by menials into a decontamination chamber, where they were washed down with high-pressure hoses of sanctified water. Messinius waited until the first of his warriors were through, watching their reactions closely. The Primaris Marines did nothing unexpected, being impassive as always. He went in the second group, beckoning Arios to come with him. High-pressure water rinsed him, while a Ministorum priest chanted rites of exorcism, a religious nonsense Messinius tolerated only because it was effective. For a while he allowed himself to meditate as the water pounded rain-hard on his battleplate and the runoff gurgled black down the drains. When this was done, he went through into a second room, where the joints of the Space Marine's armor were to be cleaned of residue by servants dressed in protective gear and watched over by yet more chanting priests. Their singing annoyed Messinius. He was a believer in the divinity of the Emperor as much as the Primarch was, which was to say, not at all. But it appeared the Neverborn believed it as fervently as any priest, and were afraid. Arios must have picked up on this, for he voxed Messinius privately. You tell me that Space Marines do not worship the Emperor, Arios said.
We don't. He is not a god. He told all who would listen that he was not a god when he walked among us. They didn't listen, we did.
The patient serfs worked little picks into their armor crevices. Messenius tolerated their presence as large predators tolerate the attentions of small animals, cleaning them of parasites.
He was seen as a god by my people, said Arios. Unlearn that. Your belief was in error.
Then why do you listen to these priests? Why are they even here? Why do you speak of faith and the power of prayer and heed the battle liturgy of your chaplains and your chapter cult? Messenius paused. What Arios wanted to understand was difficult to explain.
There is a difference between faith and truth, he said. This is my understanding of it. You will find those who say otherwise, but faith has its own power. These people believe in the emperor as a god. It is that which protects them, not the emperor himself. As the creatures and sorceries of the warp are born in the mind, then so a strong mind protects against them, no matter what the source of the strength is. Imagine if a fortress is raised in the name of the emperor, blessed and sanctified by his priests. Perhaps the emperor does listen to them. He is no god, but he is powerful beyond the understanding of mortal men. Whether he does protect them or he does not, and the words of the holy men have no effect at all, the wall still stands. A good wall, well defended, is worth 1,000 prayers.
The tiny picks worked round the rims and in the runnels of his armor. Curls of dried black ichor were carefully deposited in jars, waiting to be sealed with warding parchments.
I think faith is like that, Messenius said. It is something to strengthen the mind, a brace for the walls of breaking sanity. That does not mean it is true. Your creator, Call, for example, he has faith in his machine god. Does that protect him or any of his strange breed? I would hazard yes, or all the worlds of the Mechanicus would have fallen to chaos. The machine god and the emperor are not the same. Call is illustrative in another way, in that he has faith in himself. I therefore reason that faith of all kinds has an efficacy. We Adeptus Astartes have faith in our purpose, in our war gear, and the gifts the emperor gives us. That makes us strong.
But that is religion, said Arios.
Of a sort. Arguably, it is, I suppose, conceded Messenius.
Then we are dealing in semantics, said Arios, as thoughtfully and softly as he said everything.
Be glad that we are made for war, then, and have limited time for these discussions. Talk is not the action of warriors.
We have time now. Messenius looked to the serfs, still carefully scraping out every last piece of warp-born matter. They were going to be there for some time.
That we do, Messenius admitted.
We could draw conclusions as to the nature of the emperor by looking at his son, said Arios.
I doubt that would work, said Messenius. Guilliman is not the emperor.
I have heard the priests say he is nearly a god in his own right, higher than the saints, closer to the emperor, a demigod, humanity's saviour.
Not our saviour, humanity's saviour.
Arios already felt detached from the common man then.
He's not a god either, said Messenius,
lifting his arms to allow the serfs to blast out crusted demon matter from the ribbed joints in his armpits. What is he then? Said Arios. He had a mild tone, one of genuine curiosity. Tell me about the Primarch.
What do you wish to know?
Everything.
He is not a man, said Messenius. He's not a space marine. He's more than either, said Messenius.
He stopped. He was unwilling to make pronouncements on things he did not fully understand.
I do not know what he is. He is taller in person than he seems from a distance. He has a real presence, a great charisma. You want to obey him. Do you understand me?
Like you, said Arios. You have presence. We respect you.
What Guilliman has is little to do with rank.
I understood. What you have is not due to your rank either, said Arios. The younger Space Marine's praise embarrassed Messenius, and he became gruff.
Whatever you think I have, it is nothing compared to our Gene Father. He is...
He struggled to find the words. He whose rhetoric was still quoted to the neophytes by the chaplains. Used to be quoted, he corrected himself. Sabatine was gone. Did Kronos still stand? Were there neophytes listening to the wisdom of Chaplain Candrid in the halls of learning there, or was all that so much interstellar dust now, and he one of the last? "Brother Captain," said Arios. He reached and touched Messinius's pauldron. "He is transcendent," said Messinius tersely. "I do not know what he is in truth, whether he is a god, like the priests say, the Emperor's natural-born son, as our tradition holds it, or a work of cunning technology, as the Martians believe. All I know is that I would follow him to the gates of death itself. I would do anything for him. Nothing he could ask of me would be too much." "Including the tedious business of teaching the likes of me," said Arios. "Was that a joke, Arios?" Arios was silent a moment. "I am not sure," said Arios. Grunted Messinius. He fell into a brooding quiet. The conversation stopped, and they stood silently until the menials had finally finished with their steam jets and scrapers and rubbed their armor down. The last of the tainted water was gurgling away. It would be collected in sanctified silver tanks, then jettisoned into the void. Messinius was still thinking on Arios's question. The menials directed them from the decontamination room into a corridor where hot blasts of air dried them. "It is necessary that you are checked for signs of infection now, my lord," the mortal's supervisor said. Messinius thought hard. If the command structure of Fleet Quintus were desperate enough to hide what was going on here, and were stupid enough to move against the Adeptus Astartes, they would do it now. On the other hand, the risk of returning the plague to Fleet Primus was far greater, and he acquiesced. They went to a makeshift armory, where more serfs waited to remove their battle plate. The serfs took Messinius's power fist first, twisting free its energy feeds and unbolting the housings that clamped the outer casing over his lower right arm. 3 of them pulled it off with some difficulty and deposited it with a clang on a stand. Their clumsiness provoked a hard throat-clearing from Messinius. "Careful," he said. "That weapon was given to me by the Imperial Regent himself." That made them blanch. Messinius did not like to bait mortals, but these menials were poor, with no experience at serving transhumans. With his standard right gauntlet now exposed, Messinius took off his helm himself, causing the armory staff to rush about to fetch the stand for that too. He took in a deep breath of the metallic, sour air, welcoming the way it dried the battle sweat on his scalp. Arios deserved better than his temper, he decided, and he attempted to put his impression of the Primarch into words. "I left Sabatine when my brothers took ship for Cadia," said Messinius, "and went to Ultramar to beg for reinforcement from the Ultramarines. I did not succeed in my mission, but was instead party to the rebirth of a legend. I arrived some weeks after the Primarch had awoken. I shared in the jubilation of Ultramar, and took part in the war to save it. When Guilliman left, I accompanied him on his crusade to Terra. I was there when he went into the throne room. I stood vigil while he was within, and I was there when he emerged. I will never forget that day." Everyone in the armory was listening to him now, the Primaris Space Marines openly, the menials surreptitiously, trying but failing to appear uninterested. "Rabute Guilliman went in through the Eternity Gate itself. You would not be able to imagine the pain I felt when that gate opened. Being near while it was closed was bad enough, a great pressure in the mind, the regard of something locked away behind yards of fortifications, yet still aware of you and your every thought, your every failing, your every pathetic ambition. But when that door opened, it was blinding. I could not see inside. The priests who serve the mortals would love for me to say I saw the light and beheld the holy body of the Emperor in majesty upon his golden throne. But I saw nothing. It was like the absence of sight, as if I never had that sense, and the very notion of vision was alien to me. It was not blank or black. It was indescribable. And the pain." His expression was one of wonderment. The great pain that came out through that crack in the gate as it swung open. They opened only a crack, big enough perhaps to admit a squad marching 5 abreast. The gates are tall enough for Titans to pass through it, fully open, yet I doubt they could let out all that agony. Many of us fell to our knees. Only the Adeptus Custodes stood firm, and even they lost some of that arrogant bearing they have. Such power and such pain. And yet Gilliman had gone in there, into the throne room, and I did not see the weight of that power lie heavily upon him at all as he passed through the crack in the gates. When the door shut, our unease remained. How could anyone endure such an experience? The Adeptus Custodes told us that they survived the light of the Emperor, and so would the Primarch, though I insisted that I had seen no light. A tense calm fell on the room, and every man within it felt an echo of the power Messinius described, as if the Emperor's omnipotence clung to him and stirred as it was spoken of. A day passed, then a second. We became afraid. Again the custodians assured us that all would be well, stepping between us and the gate when we moved towards it. We were to come that close to the Master of Mankind and no closer. Gilliman emerged days later. Do not ask me how many. I could not answer with any accuracy. Close to him, time moves differently, and our battleplate systems were as affected as our minds. Gilliman emerged grim-faced, his skin ashen. He gave orders that the lords and ladies of power be assembled, for he had news to give them, that he would assume the role of regent as his father commanded, and work towards the restoration of his imperium. But he would not say what he had seen, nor what the emperor had said. To those who dared ask him, he presented a stony silence. To my knowledge, he has never told anyone, and I count myself among his confidants. I realized something that day when he came out. I saw then that for all his power, all the gifts his father had put into him, and all the responsibility that he had thrust upon him, that although he is not a man, he is human, as we are human. We must never forget that. You Primaris brothers must learn it if you have forgotten, for we are humanity's shield. We were born, and we shall die. We are changed, but our essence remains the same. And that essence, that soul, is a human soul. Gilliman is the same. He is the avenging son, but he can be hurt. He can grieve. He can make mistakes. He can die. The menials had abandoned their work, tools inactive in their hands. The Space Marines stood in a circle around their captain. Messinius looked around at them all, human and transhuman. Remember this, Arios, you others. Gilliman would be the first to say that he is not infallible, and I can find no more personal nor pertinent example than that of my own chapter, the White Consuls. We followed his teachings to the letter. We took responsibilities on ourselves that went beyond our duty as warriors. In our confidence, we sought to emulate Macragge and create a new Ultramar in the Segmentum Pacificus. Now our chapter is broken, dependent on receiving reinforcements from this crusade to survive. The Primarch's ways are not perfect, because he is human. He knows this. He says this. Many do not listen. They say he is a god, but you should heed him, not them. Follow him. Give him your hearts and your minds, but do not let his magnificence blind you, for he does not let it blind him. Willing blindness is a flaw. It led to my chapter's downfall. It led to his brother's treachery. You Primaris Marines are supposed to be better than us. Prove it by seeing the truth, and not what you wish to see. How did it happen? One of the Primaris warriors asked. How did the White Consuls fail? Messinius stared at the younger Space Marine until he dropped his gaze. A good question, Brother Lation. In our need to prove ourselves statesmen, like our Gene-Father and his exemplar sons, the Ultramarines, we forgot that the Emperor made us to be warriors first. We turned our talents to matters best left to mortal men. Gilliman's Codex says that our gifts are many, said Arios. We were not built only for war. If that is true, and I do not think it is, then now is not the time to employ our gifts for anything but war. He stared severely. I have seen this. My brothers, by losing focus, the White Consuls won the peace, but we lost the war. He held out his armored forearms to the serfs. Now, remove my armor. Run your tests. We must leave. The armory filled up with a wind of power drivers unbolting armor plates. Nobody spoke again. Chapter 25. Paperfall, the Incendiary Clan, the War of Parchment. Teasel pulled on the handle of a door that had not been opened for years. Rust clamped its hinges firmly, and he had to tug repeatedly before it gave with a sudden croak. Light flooded the derelict tunnel, very soft, but Nora's eyes had become accustomed to the dark days ago, and she squinted against it. A soft rustling came from the other side. Teasel muttered to himself and started poking about in the detritus on the floor, ignoring Nora and cackling to himself over what he found. Hungry for light and curious about the noise, she passed through the door, leaving him behind. The doorway opened onto a round metal room. Rusty pipes poked out of the floor and wall, but the machines that should have been mated to their ends had been removed a long time ago. Cables with age-brittle insulation hung stiffly from the ceiling. Water dripped from one of the pipes. The floor beneath it had corroded away, and the drops fell through into a deep hole. The walls were scabbed all over with rust and black oxidization. There was a long rectangular window in the outer wall, but the glass had gone, leaving only a few shriveled traces of rubber sealant clinging to the edge. It was an ugly room, thick with the sharp smells of mold and decay. The floor creaked under her feet. The metal stained her shoes orange. She continued forward, entranced. Through the window was the most beautiful sight she had ever seen. Sheets of paper were falling past the aperture. Some fluttered, others swooped by or spun round and around in soft, whispering flight. She went to the empty window and looked out into a wide shaft. The soft light came from high above, but the shaft was so wide that the glow penetrated all the way down. Walls with other rooms, all seemingly abandoned, rose up for hundreds of feet. They were altogether dirty, but the light was pure and white, and in its illumination the falling papers seemed so too. They sifted down, spiraling about each other. The sight tugged at things hidden deep in her soul, psychic echoes of snow and gulls in flight that her ancestors had witnessed in epochs past. She had no conception or experience of these things, but part of her in some way remembered. The papers made soft flutterings. She followed one sheet with her eyes down to the floor far below. Collectively, they made a quiet, pleasing rasp as they hit the ground. Figures in respiratory gear and armed with rakes worked the floor, dragging up the papers and feeding them into a shuddering machine at the side of the shaft that pressed them into small bales. Dust hung in a haze around them. The air smelled of parchment. She caught one of the papers. It was very thin vellum, carrying an ultima missive. A huge red stamp crossed the centre diagonally, corner to corner. Actio nulla, it read. She caught another, this one on rough paper, and another on parchment, and read them, clutching them to her breast and catching another. All were ultima priority plea missives, all of them stamped Actio nulla. The cries for help of countless worlds dismissed. A chute rattled in the curve around the wall, and a rush of papers flew out to burst into a cloud that joined the rest in floating serenely down. The papers fell. The people at the bottom raked and carried, stuffed and bundled. The machine shook and spat out cubes of pressed documents that were taken away to a cart where a pair of masked children waited in harness. Teasel gripped Nora's shoulder softly and pulled her back from the balcony edge.
"Dangerous here. Don't linger. Don't want to be seen,"
he hissed into her ear. His breath stank. "What is this place?" she asked.
"Waste,"
Teasel said. He snatched the missives she held and threw them back into the shaft.
"Documents processed, checked and disregarded. They throw the outdated ones down here. These don't even make it to the stores. The incendiary clan bundle them up, burn them for fuel, drives the generators of the missive hive cluster."
He shook his head disapprovingly.
"They burn them. Who knows how many mistakes get turned to ash, how many bad adepts go uncaught."
"How many bounties go uncollected?" she said. Her tone was lost on him.
"Yes, exactly. It's a bad business."
He looked around himself nervously.
"But, shh, be careful," he said,
holding up his finger to his lips.
"We go quiet. Don't want to be heard."
"Why is it dangerous here?" she asked.
"Gets raided,"
he said incredulously, as if she should know all about it. "Why? By who?"
Paper,
he said, gesturing at the falling documents, his irritation growing.
"Why else? There's not enough parchment or vellum or paper in this hive. Some scribe clans get desperate, come down here to steal it, scrape it clean, reuse it. If they get enough, they do their sacred duty to the Emperor. But that stops those fellows," he said with exaggerated quiet, pointing down, "doing theirs. One lot must record, another must destroy, but there is not enough to go around for both. Irony!"
He giggled, and then scowled.
Now we go. Be quiet. We don't want to get caught up in all that.
Teasel became cautious after that, putting Nora on edge. She feared to meet these paper thieves, and Teasel was graphic in his descriptions of what the incendiary clan did to those they caught in their territory. They crept down many levels, most deserted. The areas around the shaft appeared to have been abandoned centuries ago. Teasel said the burners lived near to the furnaces now, and that though they had to go that way, he knew a secret path. He led her through crooked corridors, whose floors were patterned with charred fragments of paper. Once a group of balers passed them by, all dressed the same in outsized respirators and black protective clothing. They argued with each other, in that tense yet easy way of families, though their dialect was so thick Nora couldn't understand it. She was staring at them, out in the open. If one turned to their left and looked down the side corridor she was in, they would have seen her. Teasel squawked and pulled her into a damp room, clamped his hand over her mouth, and held her until they had gone by.
Stay in cover. They squash you flat and burn you too if you stay out to be seen, he said. Do you want that?
She shook her head.
Good.
He released her. Then he found them somewhere to sleep and gave her something to eat that she did not question the origins of. It was better that way. The next day, Teasel made her walk quicker. He was getting nervous.
Too long here, too long,
he said. He paused periodically and cocked his head, listening for something.
Where are we?
She asked.
Nearly out,
he said.
Get to Grand Road over the furniture plane. Don't worry, it is high up. They'll not see you. Then through the far door and over the Stink River. There's a bridge. Find that, go over. You're in High Adept territory. Then it's time to use that seal Daddy gave you and claim Scribum Errant privilege. You get over the river, then you've come so far the Emperor must have blessed you, see? And they'll leave you alone, help you.
He pressed the side of his nose.
Only they don't know about old Teasel.
He tittered.
Anyway, they'll hear you out.
I could use the seal now, she said.
You could, and you'd be dead,
he replied.
We must hurry. There are others in these tunnels with us, and they are not friendly.
He pushed her along. Nora's hand brushed the missive again, finding comfort in the silky feel of the vellum. Through ancient passages they went, ducts and ventilation conduits, or dank places where sludgy filth ran in channels along the floor, always avoiding the crowded ways. The incendiary clan's territory was in a parlous state. Much of it was derelict, even more than in her own section. The evidence of lost glory was apparent. Nora had always taken dilapidation for granted, but presented with an example of deeper decay, she saw that it was not a constant state, and her conviction that there must have been a time when this was all new grew. She heard drums in the distance, and once loud and raucous singing. Often the smell of burning blew down the corridors on hot winds. They came to a door like dozens of others she had passed through, so she was surprised when Teasel held up a finger to his lips, his eyes bright white and frightening in his dirty face, and said, "Shh." He opened the door. It made a horrendous screech that was covered by the great racket of industry coming from the other side, along with a wash of unbearable heat. Teasel grasped Nora's hand and dragged her through onto a catwalk high over a giant space stained orange by firelight. She steeled herself to glance over the edge. There were dozens of other ways crisscrossing the space, black lines on deep fires whose fierce heat washed from open gates. In the slices of light, tiny shadow figures labored by the thousand. A carpet of spilled papers patterned the floor, hundreds of thousands of cries for help crushed underfoot by Terran serfs. People of every age and gender were at work. Menfolk used pitchforks to toss the bales into the flames. Women brought more bales in single-wheeled barrows, while children walked bent double, picking up spilled documents and stuffing them into baskets on their backs. The tasks were endless. There were always more bales coming on small trains pulled by smoke-belching engines. Hopes were consigned to the inferno. News of planets lost, burned to nothing, without thought. Nora faltered. No doubt some of the missives she had passed higher up the chain had ended their journey here.
Come, come,
Teasel said, nervously. He cringed and looked around and above, below and about, then tugged her and dragged her on. A soft noise beneath had Teasel look down. He let out a curse and shoved Nora into a crouch. Through the grill panels of the catwalk, Nora saw pale, skinny scribes sneaking over a lower crossing. Teasel repeatedly put his finger to his lips, pushing so hard they went white. Nora ignored him, watching the newcomers. They wore steel plates on their fronts and back, held together with rope. They were armed, most of them with knives, but they also had a few primitive-looking firearms scattered among them, little more than metal pipes tied to old chair legs. Nevertheless, they looked like they meant business. They wore masks of pulped paper molded into exaggerated features that gave them a fearsome appearance. They moved quietly, with the air of warriors experienced in this form of foray, despite their ramshackle equipment and obvious lack of physical prowess. Nora guessed they had done this before.
Emperor, they're heading the way we are,
Teasel said. He rolled onto his back and gulped at the air.
They're on a different bridge. All end up at the same place, he said. They're going for the storehouses to raid for fuel blocks and papers and parchments. We've got to go that way to get to the Big Stink River. They go the same way. Big fights there, often.
He frowned and twitched anxiously.
No, he said. Too dangerous. We'll get killed. We have to go back. This is over. Home time now.
But the missive.
Fie. Emperor, make waste on your missive. Teasel wants to live.
It is my holy mission, she said quietly. She felt foolish saying it out loud, but she had come to believe it was true, and her hesitancy became insistence. Her voice rose. He showed me the cards. He sent this parchment to me. It's important. I know it is.
No, we leave. Immediate and all.
Teasel flipped himself onto all fours. Nora caught his ankle and squeezed hard, so that he winced and tried to kick her, but she held him hard. My father paid you to get me to the Departamento of Final Considerations. You will take me. She put all the authority she could muster into her voice. Her habitual timidity vanished like one of the missive bricks in the furnaces.
I won't.
You made a contract with him, yes? By agreeing?
Yes,
he spat. Then if you don't honor it, you'll be just as bad as the bad scribes whose work you hunt out. I'll tell. They'll burn you, she said nastily. Teasel's fright grew.
Oh, no.
He went limp. Then take me, she said. Reluctantly, Teasel nodded.
This way,
he said, and turned around, pointing to the distant side of the furnace hall. He frowned.
Yes.
They crossed the furnace hall as fast as they could. The people below were so engrossed in their labours they never looked up, and no servo skulls or other forms of surveillance appeared to be active there, so they went by without notice, as ethereal as the heat shimmer spilling from the furnace mouths. By the time they reached the far side, and Teasel opened another door into yet another abandoned corridor, Nora was drenched in sweat. The change in temperature was so great she felt suddenly freezing. The parchment was slippery against her skin. Suddenly she panicked and pulled it out, afraid her sweat would have ruined it. But the ink had not run, and it remained legible. She rolled it up with a sigh of relief, but kept it in her hand.
Now, quick,
Teasel said. He ran to a square aperture in a wall and beckoned, then vanished down it. She jumped in after him, only to find herself speeding into the dark. The aperture had been some sort of conveyor belt once, but the belt had perished, the hard remnants of rubber ripping at her flesh as she sped down the squealing rollers that had supported it. She could not help but scream. The descent seemed to go on forever, but ended suddenly with an upturn on the roller track. She shot out into a lit space and hit a pile of loose papers hard. She rose, spitting. Her clothes were torn, covered in rust and her own blood. Teasel leapt out from behind a stack of mouldering bales and grabbed her.
Oh, why did you scream? Why?
He dragged her into a run. They were in an immense warehouse full of bale stacks. A number of tracks ran through them. One had a train upon it, the engine idling. A member of the incendiary clan hung from the window, his bloodied head emptied of brains, and she gasped loudly. "Shh," Teasel said. The bales muffled all sound, but presently she heard quiet voices. Teasel slowed and went into a quick, crouching walk. She saw the man first. One of the scribes was ripping apart a bale and plucking out the best pieces of vellum. An open satchel sat on the floor to one side of him, the body of an incendiary man to the other. He smoothed out a large piece of parchment and stared at it longingly. Teasel came to a stop. Nora banged into him. The man looked up. There was a moment of mutual surprise all round. Then he let out a piercing shriek and scrambled to his feet.
Run!
Said Teasel, and sped off. Nora ran in the other direction. The man opted to follow her. Somehow she managed to keep ahead. Perhaps her forbidden nocturnal wanderings gave her an edge in fitness. Nobody was very healthy in those depths. She was soon out of breath, but when she looked behind her, she had outpaced the raider. There was shouting coming from far off now, and the pop of low-powered gunfire. Her respite was short-lived. Another raider came running around a pile of papers boxed up in mouldering cardboard, his armor bouncing madly on his chest. His mask had half slipped, showing the Terran grey skin of his face and obscuring one of his wild eyes. His impaired vision didn't prevent him from seeing Nora, and he came directly towards her. Nora turned and ran. He discharged his firearm, but it was of such poor manufacture that it gave off nothing greater than a sustained flare around the hammer and a sulphurous stink from the muzzle, so he threw it at her. She flinched as it bounced off a wall of compressed vellum. The stock came free from the muzzle and hit her back, making her stumble. It was a small advantage, but enough. He cannoned into her back, sending her flying. She bucked and writhed as he pinned her down, managing to get herself onto her back before he backhanded her across the face. She tasted blood.
"Nice parchment," he said. "Mine."
He gripped her throat and squeezed with one hand, reaching for the missive with the other. She flailed at him, ripping at his face with her fingernails and knocking his mask off.
"I'll take it when you're dead,"
he said, clamping his other hand about her throat and squeezing. He took her blows, a maniacal grin on his face. Black spots crowded her vision. She couldn't breathe. The world receded down a dark tunnel. A shout came from what seemed far away. Something hit the man, and the weight came off her suddenly. She rolled over, choking hard. Her throat wouldn't open. She coughed and coughed until the tainted air of the deep hive filled her lungs again. Teasel was fighting the man. The pair of them were stunted examples of humanity, yet they rolled around and bludgeoned each other with shocking fierceness. She got up, staggered about, looking for the detached wooden stock of the raider's makeshift gun. She found it, picked it up, and turned around in time to see the raider gain the upper hand. A shard of glass with its handle bound in torn cloth was in his hand, and he stabbed it hard and fast into Teasel's side several times.
"Get off!"
she croaked, angrier than she had ever been, and smashed the chair leg across his head. He made a strange noise and fell sideways, but she was not done, and she thumped and thumped until his head was a soggy mess and his limbs twitched with fleeing life. Then she gave out a sob and cast the stock aside and hung her head, her hands pressed into her knees. A gasp came from behind her. "Teasel," she said. She went to him and knelt down by his side. "I thought you were dead." He coughed feebly. Frothy pink blood gathered at the corner of his mouth. His breath came fast.
"I head that way."
He smiled.
"No bad scribe me."
No, you did well."
"You go now. Get out of this place. This hall is big rectangle. Head towards the far short end."
He gasped. His chest made a horrible gurgle.
"Go upstairs. Third door left. First floor landing. Follow your nose. Big stink river. Cross."
"Teasel," she said. His eyes were fluttering.
"Hold breath. Air bad."
"Teasel, don't die," she said. He grabbed a fistful of her dress in his bloody hand.
"The Emperor protects,"
he hissed. His eyes closed, and his head lolled. The sounds of fighting were getting more intense. She could not tarry. On impulse, she kissed Teasel's filthy forehead. She picked up the bloody stock before she left. She looked about for Teasel's satchel, which contained all of their supplies, but could not find it. Too afraid to search further, she ran. Nora went through the stacks of bales as fast as she could. She went too quickly at first and was forced to stop and gasp for breath. After that, she paced herself and fell into a steady jog. The stacks of bales got higher, obscuring the ceiling and the far wall, so that she came upon the end of the warehouse quite unexpectedly. Down that end, there was no one about, and she could no longer hear the fighting. A large number of the lumen fittings hung broken from chains that were covered in so much dust they appeared like long, hairy ropes. It was dark, and she was forced to slow, the pale bale stacks smearing in her vision. She found the stair and climbed until she was above the level of the bales, where she looked back over a blocky landscape like so many piles of protein cubes. Teasel was back there somewhere. She could figure out where they had come in, but where they had fought and he had died, she could not guess. She found the door. Behind it was a long, cramped corridor that led off towards a single lit spot, at least a mile away. For a moment she dithered, wondering if she was in fact correct, but a cool wind blew, carrying with it a noisome stench so powerful she gagged. So she made her way up the corridor towards the light, and all the while the smell worsened. She stumbled a few times, not because there were obstructions in the corridor, which proved to be remarkably clear, but because she feared that there might be, and her feet anticipated obstacles that never came. So convinced she became that either she would fall on some dangerous or revolting object in the dark, or that members of the Parchment Raiders would follow and kill her, that by the time she reached the lone lumen, her nerves were shreds. The sweat had dried from her skin some time ago, but her clothes were still damp, and the air there was colder yet, and she began to shiver. The wind was full of moans and other troublesome noises carried from places she could only guess at, and her fear grew. The lumen was dull yellow and buzzed mournfully. Who knew how long it had held its solitary vigil in the bowels of the palace? It was the last of its kind. All its fellows were dead. She stepped a little past it and saw to her relief that there was a door not too distant, its lock wheel catching the last stray rays of light. She went to the wheel and spun it. It was well oiled, opening with a sigh of old air released. The smell grew worse still. There was a vestibule beyond. From it, 3 corridors branched off. She followed the one that smelled the worst. She kept on going. She had no food and no water with her. Exhaustion dragged at her feet. "When I cross the river," she promised herself, "then I shall sleep, but not until then." Several more choices of path had to be made. Every time she followed her nose. The stink grew thicker and heavier until she was forced to breathe through her mouth. Even then she could smell it and taste it, dirty and meaty against the back of her throat. Her head began to swim. She knew she was getting close. A heavy, wet slapping echoed towards her. The corridor became a bridge across a tunnel. A river of sludge sped beneath her feet, full of all the foulness humanity excretes. Yet even there, life clung on, and a dull phosphorescent glow rose from the river's edges. The far side was 100 yards away. She gulped down as much of the noxious air as she could, though it made her want to vomit, then ran. Her feet skidded on accumulations of filth on the bridge. There were no barriers, and she was forced to slow, lest she fall into the mulch and be carried away with the rest of Terra's effluvia. By the time she reached the other side, she was desperate to breathe, and only Teasel's dying admonishment kept her mouth clamped shut. There was a door there, and at first it would not give. For a few desperate moments she struggled with it, her lungs screaming, until she found a button release. She slapped it hard. It lit up orange, and the door's handle abruptly pivoted. She yanked it open and hurried through. As she did, her need to breathe overcame her, and she gulped in air. The atmosphere on the far side was purer, but the river's miasma followed her, and she fell to her knees, her head spinning, and mouth running with bitter saliva. Gagging, she shoved the door closed and waited for the air to clear. When she thought she could breathe without throwing up, she lay down. She intended only to rest a few minutes, but was soon fast asleep. Chapter 26. Dawn of Fire. An Empire Halved. Arios and the Primarch. Rabute Gilliman's flagship was even busier than the vessels of Fleet Quintus. The Dawn of Fire thronged with personnel focused on their tasks as single-mindedly as servitors.